The desert was silent before dawn. The air over Tunisia hung heavy with dust and cold, carrying only the faint clatter of tanks in the distance. Then, as the sun began to burn over the ridgelines, war erupted, and with it came a sound no German soldier had ever heard before. It wasn't the slow, deliberate crack of bolt-action rifles, that familiar rhythm of fire, click, reload, fire. It was faster, sharper, relentless, a rolling thunder of gunfire that seemed to have no pause between shots. Bang, 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 bang! It was as if the Americans were firing machine guns from their shoulders. For the veterans of the Africa Corps, it was bewildering. They were used to the steady, methodical tempo of their own Mauser 98K rifles, the weapon every German soldier trusted like an extension of his arm. One shot, lift the bolt, pull it back, chamber another round, aim again. Years of training had turned it into muscle memory, a ritual of precision. But now, in these rocky valleys outside Kasserine, that rhythm was useless. The enemy wasn't waiting to cycle bolts. He was firing again and again before they could even raise their rifles. At first, the Germans thought they were under attack by submachine guns, but the range was too long, 200 meters, maybe more, and the shots were hitting with deadly accuracy. When the fighting subsided and they examined the battlefield, the truth began to sink in. The American infantry carried a new kind of rifle, one that fired as fast as a man could pull the trigger. In the fall of 1942, during Operation Torch, U.S. forces landed in North Africa for their baptism of fire. Most of them were young, untested, still learning the language of war. But every one of them carried something that made them unique among the world's armies. The U.S. Model M1 Garand, a semi-automatic rifle unlike anything the Germans, Italians, or even the British had ever faced in mass numbers. The Garand's heart was its gas-operated system, a mechanism that used the pressure from each fired round to eject the spent casing and chamber the next automatically. 8 rounds sat neatly inside its en-bloc clip. Each pull of the trigger sent a bullet downrange, and the rifle reloaded itself with mechanical precision. No bolt to work, no hesitation, no wasted motion. For the first time, an entire army had the firepower of automatic weapons in the hands of ordinary riflemen. The first encounter came in the Tunisian campaign, near the dusty town of Sidi Bouzid. The Americans, advancing cautiously across the open desert, were ambushed by German infantry supported by panzers. Bullets tore through the sand. Tank guns roared. Amid the chaos, U.S. infantry hit the ground, took aim, and unleashed a storm. The rapid fire of hundreds of M1 rifles echoed across the ridges like the hammering of 1,000 drums. German soldiers dove for cover, shouting over the roar. Maschinengewehre, überall! Machine guns everywhere! But when they peeked over the dunes, what they saw were men. Just men, crouched behind rocks and wrecked trucks, calmly firing from their shoulders, each shot placed with deadly calm. Within minutes, the ambush collapsed. The Germans fell back, leaving behind spent shells and stunned survivors. One captured Feldwebel, still shaking, told his interrogators, "Your men fire without stopping. They don't even move the bolt." The American officer smiled. That's the idea. The M1 Garand had been in production since 1936, but this was its first major test in real combat. Even many American troops had doubted it at first. It was heavier than the old Springfield 1903, and its 8-round clip sometimes made a distinctive ping when empty. But on the battlefields of North Africa, every man who carried one quickly learned to trust it with his life. Corporal Thomas Maguire of the 1st Infantry Division described his first firefight this way. "I fired as fast as I could pull the trigger. The rifle just kept feeding itself. I looked down the sights, saw a German running, squeezed, then another and another. They never had time to reload." That night, as the unit regrouped around a smoking half-track, the talk wasn't about tactics or orders, it was about the rifle. The men passed their Garands around, grinning, hands black with oil and sand. One private said, "Feels like we're carrying the future." The Germans, meanwhile, were already reporting their shock up the chain of command. Intelligence officers filed memos describing a semi-automatic rifle in mass use by American infantry. One report read, "The enemy's rate of fire is at least double ours. Infantry assaults supported by these weapons inflict severe losses before our troops can close the distance." Even Field Marshal Erwin Rommel took note. His Africa Corps, accustomed to dominating through mobility and precision, suddenly found themselves trading fire with opponents who could sustain a continuous volley without reloading. For the first time, German tactical superiority was being challenged by technology, not tanks or aircraft, but the rifles in the hands of ordinary soldiers. In one engagement outside Mcnassy, a German platoon tried to pin down an American patrol. The U.S. soldiers hit the dirt behind a low ridge and returned fire. Within seconds, the Germans' assault stalled. Their officers shouted for covering fire, but their own Mausers, limited by human speed, couldn't match the Americans' rate of fire. The attack disintegrated under the weight of what one observer called a wall of lead. Afterward, German medics found themselves treating survivors who swore the Americans must have been armed with automatic weapons. When captured rifles were examined, their simplicity stunned the inspectors. No complex mechanism, no external magazine, just a clean, efficient system that turned every trigger pull into a bullet. As the campaign dragged on into 1943, the M1 Garand became more than a weapon. It became a psychological edge. American troops fought with growing confidence, knowing they could deliver more rounds faster than their enemy. Every firefight reinforced the lesson: speed kills. In the smoking ruins of a Tunisian village, a German officer stared at one of the captured rifles lying in the sand. He lifted it, studied the design, and muttered, "Ein Schuss, noch ein Schuss, ohne Bolzen." One shot, another shot, without a bolt. Then he set it down, shaking his head. By the end of the North African campaign, even the most hardened Wehrmacht veterans had learned to recognize the sound of the Garand. It wasn't just gunfire. It was the sound of an army built by industry, of a nation that could mass-produce innovation and put it in every soldier's hands. The desert wind carried that rhythm across the dunes. 8 shots, a metallic ping, and then silence. But for the men who faced it, that silence came too late. The rifle that fired without a bolt had already changed the future of warfare, and Germany had heard its warning in the sands of Africa.
When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the men who returned home from Europe and the Pacific carried with them not just scars and memories, but a deep reverence for the rifle that had never failed them. The M1 Garand was no longer just a weapon. It was a symbol of survival, of ingenuity, of a nation that had armed ordinary men with something extraordinary. General George S. Patton would put it best. "In my opinion, the M1 rifle is the greatest battle implement ever devised." He wasn't exaggerating. The rifle had changed the very rhythm of war, and in doing so, it had changed the men who fought it. After the victory parades and homecomings, the rifles that had crossed deserts, stormed beaches, and trudged through snow were stacked in armories or hung on walls. Their stocks bore scratches from barbed wire, the initials of soldiers carved during quiet nights, and the dark stains of oil and sweat. Each one was a story in steel and wood. For years after the war, veterans would gather in small town halls and tell the same story, how their Garands had jammed only once in 1,000 rounds, how it had fired in the rain when nothing else would, how its ping still echoed in their ears decades later. One veteran from the 1st Infantry said simply, "When you had a Garand, you never felt outgunned." The world, however, had changed. The end of the war marked the beginning of a new age, the Cold War, the Jet Age, the dawn of nuclear fear. Yet the M1 refused to fade into history. In 1950, when North Korean forces stormed across the 38th parallel, the Garand once again found itself in the hands of young Americans. On the frozen hills of Korea, it performed just as faithfully as it had in France and Bastogne. In temperatures that turned oil to ice and numbed fingers to stone, the M1 still cycled, still fired, still killed. Chinese soldiers charging across the snow found themselves cut down by the same steady cadence that had once stunned the Wehrmacht. A Marine corporal at the Chosin Reservoir recalled, "It was so cold the bolts on our trucks froze, but the Garand never missed a beat. It was like fighting with an old friend who'd come back for one last battle." By then, the rifle had become more than technology. It was a bridge between generations of soldiers, a connection between the boys who fought in Tunisia and the ones who fought in Korea. Production continued through the 1950s, with over 6 million rifles built in total. Countries across the world adopted or copied it, from Denmark to Japan, from Italy to South Korea. The Soviets analyzed captured Garands and admitted, quietly, that no rifle in their arsenal matched its balance of power and reliability. But even as the M1's legend grew, the world of warfare was evolving again. New rifles, lighter, faster, using detachable magazines, began to take its place. By the early 1960s, the M14 and later the M16 would replace it in American service. Yet for all the technological advances, many veterans never let go of their faith in the Garand. Those new rifles spit bullets, but the Garand speaks. Its voice lingered in other ways, too. In the years after the war, the M1 became a symbol of American craftsmanship and faith in progress. It represented the power of industry harnessed for defense, the marriage of precision engineering and mass production. In Springfield Armory, the birthplace of the rifle, tours were given to students who marveled at how one man's idea had armed millions. And then there was John Garand himself, the quiet engineer who had never sought fame or fortune. After the war, he continued to refine small arms designs, but refused to profit personally from his invention. He lived modestly, tending his garden, answering letters from grateful soldiers. When asked what he felt about creating a weapon that had changed history, he replied, "I built it to work, and it did." In 1953, he retired from Springfield Armory. 2 years later, the U.S. government awarded him the Medal of Merit. When he died in 1974, veterans across America paused to remember the man whose hands had shaped the rifle they trusted with their lives. Today, the M1 Garand rests in museums, honor guards, and private collections around the world, not as a relic, but as a reminder. Its design remains admired by engineers and collectors alike, perfectly balanced, durable, and powerful. Modern rifles may be lighter, may hold more rounds, but few inspire the same respect. In firing ranges and veterans' reunions, the Garand still speaks. The heavy thump of its .306 round, the clean metallic ring of its clip ejecting, the smell of oil and powder. To those who listen, that sound isn't just nostalgia, it's history breathing. Because behind every mechanical click lies what it represented. The moment a democratic nation decided that every soldier, no matter his rank or birthplace, deserved the best weapon in the world, and got it. It wasn't just a rifle that fired without working the bolt. It was a rifle that closed the gap between man and machine, between factory and battlefield, between invention and survival. It proved that a single innovation, conceived by an immigrant engineer and built by millions of American hands, could shift the balance of a global war. General Patton's words still echo wherever that rifle is displayed. The greatest battle implement ever devised. But for those who carried it, it was something simpler, something deeper, a companion that never faltered, a tool that gave them a fighting chance, a piece of America they held in their hands. And when they fired it, 8 sharp reports followed by that unmistakable ping. It wasn't just metal and powder at work. It was the sound of an idea taking form, that freedom, when armed with ingenuity, could never be outgunned. By the summer of 1944, the thunder that had first echoed in the deserts of North Africa was rolling across Europe. The American soldier no longer marched as a novice. He was a professional, disciplined, confident, and armed with the rifle that had become the beating heart of his army, the M1 Garand. Everywhere the U.S. advanced, through hedgerows, towns, and frozen forests, the rhythm of its semi-automatic fire announced its presence long before the enemy was seen. When the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, the Garand led the way. In the chaos of Omaha Beach, where waves of men waded through surf and bullets to reach the shingle, the rifle's reliability meant survival. Sand and salt water fouled every weapon they touched, but the M1 kept working. Soldiers crawled behind obstacles, firing from the hip, reloading with practiced speed. The metallic ping of empty clips drowned by the roar of the sea and the scream of shells. Private Harold Beck of the 1st Infantry Division later wrote in his journal, "You didn't think, you just fired, again and again. The Garand didn't jam, didn't quit. It was the only thing that felt steady when the whole world was falling apart." Once inland, the true genius of the rifle revealed itself. Normandy's bocage, centuries-old hedgerows turned into green walls, turned every field into a trap. German troops waited with MG-42s and Mauser rifles behind every earthen bank. But American squads, each armed with rapid-firing Garands, began to learn a new rhythm of attack: suppress, flank, overwhelm. A typical U.S. infantry squad had one Browning automatic rifle for heavy support. The rest relied on their Garands. Yet together they produced such a dense volume of fire, the German soldiers often mistook them for entire machine gun sections. "They shoot like devils," a captured German wrote in July 1944. "No pause, no reloading, only the ping when it is too late." As the Allies broke through at Saint-Lô and surged across France, the Garand became the sound of momentum itself. In towns like Mortagne, Chartres, and Metz, the clatter of American rifles echoed through cobbled streets as house-to-house fighting erupted. In close quarters, where the Mauser's bolt was a liability, the Garand's trigger speed and accuracy dominated. Soldiers could fire, move, and fire again without breaking aim, clearing stairwells and alleys in seconds. At the same time, the rifle's durability earned near-mythic status. Mud, rain, and grit failed to stop it. Soldiers joked that you could dunk it in coffee and it would still shoot. During the long marches through France, GIs wiped them with engine oil, wrapped them in ponchos, and trusted them more than any other piece of gear. When autumn came and the Allies pushed toward Germany's border, the rifle that had once astonished the Wehrmacht in Tunisia was now everywhere. The sound of semi-automatic fire had become the soundtrack of defeat for the Reich. Then came the Ardennes, December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, the last great gamble of the German army. The snow was deep, the cold merciless, the forests thick with fog and fear. German soldiers in white camouflage launched their counteroffensive through the Belgian woods, catching the Americans off guard. Whole units were surrounded or cut off. Ammunition froze, fuel lines cracked, and weapons stiffened in the cold. But the Garand kept firing. In foxholes outside Bastogne, men of the 101st Airborne and 28th Infantry fought off wave after wave of attacks. When the Luftwaffe strafed from above, when panzers rumbled through the trees, the M1's report cracked like lightning through the snow. Its semi-automatic action, driven by hot gases from each shot, kept cycling even as bolts on German Mausers froze solid. Sergeant Earl Long remembered, "The Krauts would shoot once, maybe twice, and we'd answer with 10. You could hear the difference. Their fire came in claps. Ours was a drum roll." In one infamous engagement near Foy, an American platoon low on ammunition used the Garand's precision to deadly effect, picking off advancing Germans one by one. Every shot counted, Long said. We weren't just holding the line, we were writing it. As the Allies crossed into Germany in early 1945, the psychological weight of the rifle had become undeniable. German prisoners spoke of it with reluctant respect. They had feared the Thompson submachine gun at close range, the Browning machine gun at long, but the Garand haunted them everywhere in between. One captured officer told his interrogators at Remagen, "Your men fire like machines, but they aim like hunters. We never had such a weapon." Even in ruined towns where rubble turned streets into labyrinths, the Garand's steady cadence never faltered. In Cologne and Frankfurt, soldiers cleared buildings by the flash of muzzle fire reflecting off shattered glass. The rifle's 8-round clip was both limitation and rhythm, each ping a heartbeat before the next storm of bullets. By the time American troops reached the Rhine, the M1 had become more than a piece of equipment. It was a companion, a lifeline, and a symbol of the new kind of warfare America had brought to Europe. Industrial speed married to human precision. It didn't just change tactics, it changed morale. An officer in Patton's Third Army wrote in a letter home, "Our riflemen fight with confidence because they trust their rifles more than luck. They can outshoot anything the Germans carry, and they know it." The Garand gave every man, farm boy, factory worker, student, the firepower of 2 soldiers. In an army built on logistics and mass production, it made the individual matter again. When victory finally came in May 1945, the battle-weary soldiers who leaned on their Garands as they marched through ruined German cities knew what it had cost. The wood was scarred, the barrels worn thin, but the rifles had carried them from the beaches of North Africa to the heart of the Reich. Historians would later argue about what won the war: tanks, planes, codebreakers, or bombs. But the men who fought it knew another truth. They had seen how a single innovation in the hands of a determined soldier could shift the balance of a battle, even of history. In the hedgerows, in the snow, in the ruins of Europe, the M1 Garand had earned its legend. It was not just a rifle, it was the voice of a generation. 8 sharp notes of freedom, echoing across a continent in ruin. And as the war ended, that voice was still heard, steady and clear, the rhythm of democracy armed, the song of a people who built a weapon not just to fight, but to finish what they started.
The first time the M1 Garand went to war, it met the enemy under a desert sun. In November 1942, American soldiers stepped off landing craft onto the beaches of North Africa, carrying weapons that few of them had ever fired in anger. The Garand's walnut stocks gleamed. Its metal was clean and oiled. The rifles looked brand new because they were. They were untested, just like the men who carried them. Ahead lay Rommel's Afrika Korps, veterans hardened by years of battle, masters of deception, mobility, and precision. The Americans were about to learn how to fight. The Germans were about to learn how the world had changed. At first, the engagements were chaotic. The Americans moved through barren hills and dry wadis, fighting an enemy they could barely see. The Germans struck like ghosts, mortar shells, machine gun bursts, then silence. But when the infantry finally met face to face, the difference was immediate. In one skirmish near Sidi Bouzid, a platoon of U.S. soldiers from the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, came under fire from German riflemen entrenched along a ridge. The enemy's Mauser 98Ks cracked sharply, each shot deliberate and precise. The Americans hit the dirt, then returned fire. But instead of answering with the slow, rhythmic cadence the Germans expected, boom, click, clack, boom, they unleashed a storm. The sound of the M1 Garands filled the valley like thunder, rapid and constant, each trigger pull sending a new bullet downrange without pause. Within seconds, the ridge erupted in dust and screams. One German survivor later said,
It sounded like a line of machine guns, but they were too accurate. They never stopped firing. The Garand had drawn its first blood. Over the next weeks, as U.S. forces advanced deeper into Tunisia, the rifle's reputation spread like wildfire. German officers began warning their men, "Do not underestimate the American rifleman. His weapon fires faster than ours." But even knowing it didn't help. At the Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943, the first major clash between American and German forces, the Garand proved its worth under the harshest conditions imaginable. The battlefield was chaos, swirling sand, broken armor, shattered trucks, and soldiers fighting in confusion. The Americans, poorly coordinated and inexperienced, suffered terrible losses in armor and artillery. But in the infantry lines, something unexpected happened. Small groups of GIs, scattered and isolated, used their M1s to hold positions long after they should have been overrun. One German assault platoon, advancing through the dust, was stopped cold by a handful of American riflemen firing in disciplined volleys. The rapid fire was so intense that German commanders believed they were facing a full machine gun section. When the smoke cleared, the Americans were gone, but dozens of Germans lay still, cut down by 8-round clips fired with mechanical precision. The Garand's reliability also shocked its users. In the choking sand and heat, many weapons jammed, but not the M1. Its gas system, sealed and self-cleaning, shrugged off dust and grit that would have disabled other rifles. One corporal recalled, "You could drop it in the dirt, pick it up, slap the bolt, and she'd fire like nothing happened." The rifle's signature sound, the metallic ping of the empty clip ejecting, became part of the battlefield's rhythm. At first, soldiers worried the noise might reveal when they were out of ammunition. In reality, few Germans ever heard it. They were usually too busy diving for cover from the next barrage. In Tunisia's close fights and open ambushes, the Garand gave the Americans something they had lacked at the start of the war: confidence. A rifleman could now fire 8 accurate shots as fast as he could think. He didn't have to break aim. He didn't have to fight the bolt. He could control the fight, not react to it. Major Robert Cole of the 9th Infantry wrote in a field report, "The M1 changes the way a man fights. He doesn't hesitate between rounds. He doesn't fear the reload. The fire just keeps coming." Even the Germans began to respect it in their own grim way. After a firefight near Gafsa, a Wehrmacht patrol recovered several M1s from American casualties. The soldiers passed them around, testing the action. One of them muttered, "Wunderbar." But when they tried to disassemble the rifle, sand poured from the stock. It still fired perfectly. "Amerikanisch," another said with a frown. Typical Americans, machines that never stop. When the campaign in North Africa ended in May 1943, the Americans were no longer green. They had bled, learned, and hardened. And they carried with them a weapon that had earned its legend. But the rifle's true glory was yet to come. That summer, the Allies crossed the Mediterranean and landed in Sicily, beginning the long, grinding climb toward Europe. The island was a fortress of hills, olive groves, and stone villages, defended by German paratroopers and Italian troops. The fighting was closer now, room to room, hedge to hedge. In these brutal engagements, the semi-automatic action of the Garand gave the Americans an overwhelming edge. While German soldiers struggled to work their bolts in cramped alleyways and stairwells, GIs fired continuous streams of accurate shots without shifting their grip. In one firefight near Sidi Bouzid, a platoon of U.S. soldiers from the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, came under fire from German riflemen entrenched along a ridge. The enemy's Mauser 98Ks cracked sharply, each shot deliberate and precise. The Americans hit the dirt, then returned fire. But instead of answering with the slow, rhythmic cadence the Germans expected, boom, click, clack, boom, they unleashed a storm. The sound of the M1 Garands filled the valley like thunder. rapid and constant, each trigger pull sending a new bullet downrange without pause. Within seconds, the ridge erupted in dust and screams. One German survivor later said, "It sounded like a line of machine guns, but they were too accurate. They never stopped firing." The Garand had drawn its first blood. Over the next weeks, as U.S. forces advanced deeper into Tunisia, the rifle's reputation spread like wildfire. German officers began warning their men, "Do not underestimate the American rifleman. His weapon fires faster than ours." But even knowing it didn't help. At the Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943, the first major clash between American and German forces, the Garand proved its worth under the harshest conditions imaginable. The battlefield was chaos, swirling sand, broken armor, shattered trucks, and soldiers fighting in confusion. The Americans, poorly coordinated and inexperienced, suffered terrible losses in armor and artillery. But in the infantry lines, something unexpected happened. Small groups of GIs, scattered and isolated, used their M1s to hold positions long after they should have been overrun. One German assault platoon, advancing through the dust, was stopped cold by a handful of American riflemen firing in disciplined volleys. The rapid fire was so intense that German commanders believed they were facing a full machine gun section. When the smoke cleared, the Americans were gone, but dozens of Germans lay still, cut down by 8-round clips fired with mechanical precision. The Garand's reliability also shocked its users. In the choking sand and heat, many weapons jammed, but not the M1. Its gas system, sealed and self-cleaning, shrugged off dust and grit that would have disabled other rifles. One corporal recalled, "You could drop it in the dirt, pick it up, slap the bolt, and she'd fire like nothing happened." The rifle's signature sound, the metallic ping of the empty clip ejecting, became part of the battlefield's rhythm. At first, soldiers worried the noise might reveal when they were out of ammunition. In reality, few Germans ever heard it. They were usually too busy diving for cover from the next barrage. In Tunisia's close fights and open ambushes, the Garand gave the Americans something they had lacked at the start of the war: confidence. A rifleman could now fire 8 accurate shots as fast as he could think. He didn't have to break aim. He didn't have to fight the bolt. He could control the fight, not react to it. Major Robert Cole of the 9th Infantry wrote in a field report, "The M1 changes the way a man fights. He doesn't hesitate between rounds. He doesn't fear the reload. The fire just keeps coming." Even the Germans began to respect it in their own grim way. After a firefight near Gafsa, a Wehrmacht patrol recovered several M1s from American casualties. The soldiers passed them around, testing the action. One of them muttered, "Wunderbar." But when they tried to disassemble the rifle, sand poured from the stock. It still fired perfectly. "Amerikanisch," another said with a frown. Typical Americans, machines that never stop. When the campaign in North Africa ended in May 1943, the Americans were no longer green. They had bled, learned, and hardened. And they carried with them a weapon that had earned its legend. But the rifle's true glory was yet to come. That summer, the Allies crossed the Mediterranean.
Before it became a sound that terrified German soldiers in North Africa, the M1 Garand was just an idea, a sketch on an engineer's table, drawn by a quiet man who believed machines could change the way wars were fought. His name was John Cantius Garand, a Canadian-born machinist who had immigrated to the United States as a boy, working first in textile mills, then in small arms workshops. He wasn't a soldier, nor a general, nor even a particularly ambitious man. But inside his mind lived a vision that would one day rewrite the future of infantry combat. In the early 1920s, America's Army was still using the same bolt-action rifles that had fought in the Great War, the Springfield M1903, a fine, accurate weapon, but one that demanded rhythm. Aim, fire, lift the bolt, pull back,
push forward, fire again. It was a rifle for marksmen, not for a world speeding toward mechanized chaos. Across the ocean, tanks and planes were transforming warfare into something faster and more brutal. To many officers, it was clear that a soldier fumbling with a bolt between shots would soon be left behind. At the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts, the oldest weapons factory in the United States, the Army began searching for a replacement. Dozens of inventors came forward with prototypes: gas traps, recoil systems, clip-fed rifles of all shapes and weights. Some worked on paper, few in practice. But in 1919, John Garand arrived at Springfield with a design that caught their attention: a semi-automatic rifle using the power of gas from each fired round to cycle the action automatically. It was elegant, efficient, and, crucially, reliable. Garand wasn't a man of many words. Colleagues remembered him as meticulous, soft-spoken, always carrying a small notebook. He would spend nights in the machine shop, adjusting tolerances by fractions of a millimeter, running his hands along the metal to feel imperfections no gauge could measure. He treated steel like a living thing, one worker said. He didn't build guns, he raised them. Through the 1920s and 30s, Garand's prototype evolved. Early versions were heavy and temperamental. Some jammed after a few rounds, others overheated. The Army tested and rejected them repeatedly, but Garand never gave up. He redesigned the gas system, rebalanced the bolt, refined the trigger group, and simplified the loading mechanism until everything moved with the smoothness of a clock. The heart of his creation was its gas-operated system, a small port near the end of the barrel that bled off expanding gases after each shot, driving a piston that unlocked the bolt and chambered the next round automatically. It was elegant, efficient, and, crucially, reliable. By 1933, the design was nearly perfect. Garand presented it to the Ordnance Department for final trials. His rivals, including the Johnson rifle and other experimental designs, still relied on complex mechanisms or detachable magazines that jammed easily. Garand's rifle, by contrast, was balanced, sturdy, and easy to mass produce, the kind of weapon an industrial nation could build by the thousands. In 1936, after nearly a decade of refinement, the U.S. Army officially adopted it as the U.S. Rifle Caliber .30 M1. The announcement barely made headlines. Most Americans had never heard of Garand, and few realized what had just happened. Yet for those who understood, it marked the beginning of a new era. The United States had become the first nation in history to equip its infantry with a semi-automatic rifle as standard issue. Still, not everyone was convinced. Traditionalists in the Army grumbled that it was too heavy, too complex, too wasteful of ammunition. Some officers insisted that the old Springfield bolt-action rifle was good enough. Others doubted whether the country's factories could produce the new rifle fast enough for an army of millions. But Garand was patient. He trusted the math, the mechanics, and the philosophy behind his design, that speed and reliability were not luxuries, but necessities. At the Springfield Armory, production lines were retooled under his supervision. Machines carved receivers from solid blocks of steel. Women joined the workforce for the first time, assembling triggers, polishing bolts, packing rifles into wooden crates stamped U.S. Army property. Garand himself walked the floor daily, inspecting the assembly line with a craftsman's eye. When a machinist asked how precise a part needed to be, Garand smiled faintly and said, "As perfect as a life depends on it, because it will." While the world slid toward war, Garand's rifle quietly became the backbone of America's rearmament. By 1940, thousands of M1s were rolling out of Springfield every month. They were sent to training camps across the United States, where young recruits learned to shoot them for the first time. Instructors marveled at the speed and accuracy even new soldiers achieved. "It's like magic," one drill sergeant said. "Pull the trigger, bang. Pull again, Bang! You don't even have to think. It just goes. For the first time, the average American infantryman could deliver sustained fire comparable to that of elite marksmen in other armies. It was a democratization of firepower, a reflection of the country itself, practical, industrial, and unstoppable once in motion. In Europe, meanwhile, war had already consumed the continent. Germany's army swept across Poland and France, armed with the venerable Carabiner 98K, a rifle designed before the First World War. It was precise, durable, and deadly, but it was still a bolt-action weapon, one shot at a time. German soldiers were trained to make each bullet count. Their commanders believed discipline and marksmanship mattered more than speed. In America, John Garand and the engineers at Springfield believed something entirely different, that in modern warfare, rhythm was everything. A rifle that could fire 8 aimed shots in quick succession would let the soldier control the tempo of battle, not merely respond to it. By 1941, as the clouds of war rolled across the Pacific, the M1 Garand stood ready. Garand himself received quiet recognition from Washington, a medal, a handshake, a letter of thanks. But he returned to his workshop, preferring to spend his days refining new tools and gauges. When reporters asked what it felt like to have invented the Army's new rifle, he shrugged and said, "I just wanted it to work right." It did. In December 1941, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States entered the war. From the factories of Massachusetts to the training grounds of Kansas, M1 rifles poured into the hands of young men bound for Africa, Europe, and the Pacific. They carried them across oceans and deserts, through jungles and ruins. Most of those soldiers never knew the man who built their rifle, but every time they fired it, every time the bolt snapped forward and the next round slid into the chamber with mechanical certainty, they felt the genius of John Garand, a quiet immigrant who had given an army the ability to strike faster than any in history. Soon, the world would hear what that sounded like.